So hi, my name is Kate Guastaferro, and I am an assistant research professor at Penn State University, and I'm really pleased to be with you all virtually today to tell you about the multi-phase optimization strategy and how you might use that for the development, optimization, and evaluation of multi-component interventions. We have quite a stack of learning objectives to get through today in just 45 minutes. But my goal and my kind of approach to today's presentation is to whet your appetite, to get you to start thinking about how you could apply MOST to your field of study, and then direct you to some resources on how to support your actual use of MOST moving forward. There's no possible way I could give you all information on MOST in 45 minutes. We barely get through it in 5 days of a training. So bear with me as we go through this today. I do want to acknowledge Linda Collins is the developer of MOST, and our work has been supported by the National Institutes of Health for the past 25 plus years, and that's my acknowledgements as we get started. All right, so let's dig into it. Historically, the way that we as a field and as a science have approached intervention development is through something we call the treatment package approach. So you identify components through the literature, through studies that you think have an important effect on the outcome you're after. You package them together, put them into this black box, create this intervention, and then you test it with an RCT. Many interventions have been developed this way, and while we're not anti-RCT, we want to acknowledge that an RCT cannot identify the contribution of individual components to the desired outcome. We don't know whether the inclusion of one component has a positive or negative effect on another component. We also don't know if a component's contribution offsets its cost. So think for a moment about a very costly, be it money or time, component that you're interested in or that's relevant in your field. Do you know if its contribution towards your outcome actually offsets how much it costs to implement? You wouldn't know that from traditional RCT data. With the RCT, we also are unable to determine whether all of the components are really needed. How often do you hear an intervention scientist say or acknowledge that they've taken the kitchen sink approach, where they've just chucked everything that they think could affect the outcome into an intervention? Well, with the RCT, you don't know if you need to take that approach. And then finally, with the RCT, you also don't know how to make the intervention more effective, more efficient, or more scalable moving forward. You'll also perhaps agree with me, I hope, that the RCT is resource intensive while producing limited information that I've just shared with you. The RCT is demanding in terms of time, money, person hours, the list goes on. The RCT is also by definition conducted in a highly controlled environment, and that's not always the real world, which limits the scalability of the intervention post-research. And then if you're like me, oftentimes the RCT doesn't produce a positive effect. And so you've done all of this work, spent all of this money and time, and you don't have a positive effect to show from it. The way forward is not super clear. So here is a solution to some of those challenges that we've just gone through. That is the multi-phase optimization strategy, or MOST. And MOST is an engineering-inspired framework for optimizing multi-component behavioral interventions. So let's break this down a bit. When I say component, I mean anything that can be separated out for study. That might be a content-related component. So an emotion regulation session or mindfulness as a content type of component. Now, a component could also be related to engagement. So say it's a strategy to do text messages between visits to remind the participant of skills that you've taught them, kind of like a reinforcement, or a reminder of their upcoming appointment. Finally, a component might also be related to fidelity. And so perhaps you're interested in examining different training strategies or supervision strategies of your providers of an intervention. So all of those things are components. Optimization has a very specific definition under the framework of MOST. So optimization is the process of identifying an intervention that provides the best expected outcome obtainable within key constraints. By constraint, I mean anything that can interfere with implementation. That might be time, money, cost of a component, etc. So this is what happens with MOST. It looks quite similar to the treatment package approach that we went over at the beginning, but we're still identifying components, still through theory, still through empirical studies, still through existing interventions. But before we automatically put them together, we're going to empirically examine the way that each of those components affects the outcome of interest and the way that those components work in the presence and absence of one another. That's this process of optimization. Using those data from that empirical study, we then identify and package, if you will, an optimized behavioral intervention. Now, what's different is the box here is no longer black. We know exactly what's happening in the intervention, how those components are affecting our outcome, and how they are affecting each other. That optimized intervention then gets evaluated in a randomized control trial as usual, as you're accustomed to if you've been trained. So the RCT doesn't go away. It's just that through this optimization process, by the time we get to the RCT, where all of those constraints are still there, we have a better understanding of the intervention that then makes better use of the resources needed to do the RCT. So an intervention scientist adopting the MOST framework, like any other time, is after an intervention that is effective, of course, but also an intervention that is efficient, so it avoids wasting time, money, or other resources, an intervention that is economical, meaning that it's effective without exceeding budgetary constraints. So say you know that a provider will only spend $500, when I say provider, I mean like insurance, right? Is only gonna spend $500 per participant, per subject, per patient in the real world. Well, if you develop an intervention that costs $1,000 per person to implement, there's no way anybody's gonna pick it up and take it. They can't afford it, which leads to the fourth desiderata, which is scalability. And that's the extent to which the intervention can be implemented widely with fidelity. So we're after all four of these things. And of course, it kind of, achieving economy might come at the cost of some efficiency and vice versa. But we're after kind of affecting all four of these things with an optimized intervention. And in my opinion, the scalability desiderata is particularly of interest in the setting of this conference. So here is the framework of MOST, and we're going to go through this in detail, but MOST is comprised of three phases: preparation, optimization, and evaluation. So let's begin with preparation. In the preparation phase, we are laying the groundwork for optimization. And the activities of this are very much in line with what we've done historically. One of the hallmarks of the preparation phase is the development of a conceptual model. This is the engine of the intervention. We're describing how each one of the components that we are identifying is designed and how it will affect our ultimate outcome of interest. So the conceptual model is informed by theory, as well as empirical studies. And it can be simple, like you see on the screen, or it can get more complex, which I'll show you in a couple minutes. But the important part to note about the conceptual model is it's not a structural equation model, it's not a logic model. This is really about the engine, how you are designing and how you think this intervention is going to affect what you're interested in. Also, in the preparation phase, so we've identified the conceptual model, what the components are. Maybe we've done some pilot testing of those components. We also are going to identify our optimization criterion. And this sounds really complicated, maybe a little scary, but it's simple. It's just the goal of the intervention, your operational definition. It might be as simple, your optimization criterion might be as simple as an all active components criterion. This means that you are only going to include components that have a positive effect on your outcome of interest. So you're trimming things that don't produce an effect. That's a really great place to start. You might be able to consider optimization criterions that take into account time. So if you know that your provider, in the real world, there's only 45 minutes to deliver an intervention to someone. Well, that becomes a constraint. And so your optimization criterion then is the most effective intervention that can be implemented in 45 minutes or less. Another option here is cost. Let's say you know that your insurer, the people who will pay for this intervention in the real world, will only pay $500 per person. So your optimization criterion then becomes the intervention that produces the best expected outcome obtainable for up to $500 per person. So this is where most really separates itself and makes itself unique from the traditional approach. So now we're into the second phase, optimization, and this is uniquely most, right? The optimization phase, the hallmark of it is the conduct of an optimization trial, this empirical examination of components. So the optimization trial could really be any experimental design, but it needs to be determined by your research question, as well as the type of intervention you are developing. Now, by type of intervention, I mean, are you delivering a fixed intervention where everybody gets the same level of intervention, or is it an adaptive intervention where based on someone's response at a pre-specified point in time, they might get a different level of the intervention? That's an adaptive intervention. Finally, the design of the optimization trial should be dictated by the resource management principle. This is an engineering-inspired principle where it says that you shouldn't design an experiment that you do not have the resources to conduct. Simple, but mind-blowing. So if your question lends itself to, let's say, a 5-arm randomized control trial, well, you certainly are not going to have the resources, be it in terms of money or in terms of the people, like the subjects, to carry that out. So that's not the right experimental design according to the resource management principle. So you take all of those things into account. I'll pause here just to mention this figure, which comes from Linda's book, Introducing Most. And you see that the type of intervention is matched with the experimental design. So for example, laser pointer, the fixed intervention is best matched with the factorial or fractional factorial experiment. And so you see that because the bar is dark. Then as we go down to adaptive interventions, the factorial is no longer the appropriate or the best experimental design. It goes this way, maybe towards a system identification experiment or a micro-randomized trial. So the type of intervention you're developing dictates the type of experimental design you use. This is an important distinction that some people overlook or conflate easily. So good to point this out. So my work and my experience is predominantly with fixed interventions and therefore the factorial experiment. I'm going to walk through a couple examples using that design and the features of the design. So I don't know about many of you, but the factorial experimental design was not part of my, graduate training in experimental design or research methods. I knew about a 2x2 factorial, but beyond that, it wasn't covered. So I just want to pause here to kind of say that's normal and share with you that some features of the factorial experiment. So here I'm depicting 4 factors. So these are the same as components, but we talk about components in the intervention design, and when we talk about experimental design, the same thing gets called now a factor. So each of these factors has 2 levels, depicted here as either on or off, but it might also be low or high. It is possible in a factorial experiment to have more than 2 levels, but that really complicates your sample size and power calculation. So our recommendation is to always consider 2 levels as much as you possibly can. So a 4-factor factorial experiment with 2 levels each is denoted as a 2 to the 4th factorial experiment, which yields 16 experimental conditions. And just to put this into context, a 2 to the 5th, where there are 5 factors with 2 levels each, yields 32 experimental conditions. And this experimental design table, we often recommend that you include that in grant proposals to walk through everybody with the different randomization schema and estimates, which I'll get to in a second. So the factorial experiment, when used to answer the appropriate research questions, actually require many fewer subjects than alternative designs. So you just heard me say that a 2 to the 4 is 16 experimental conditions, which sounds a lot. But in this design, there are oftentimes a small per condition n, and still maintaining all this power. Let me show you what I mean. So this is an example of from the conceptual model slide a couple slides before. There were 5 potential components. So if I chose to do individual experiments for each of those 5 components with a 2-arm RCT for each one of those, I would need 10 experimental conditions, and to detect an effect, a Cohen's d of 0.3 and maintain power greater than 0.8, I would need 1,760 subjects. And I can't estimate any of the interactions between those different components, factors. So alternatively, let's say I wanted to do a comparative treatment design. So here I have my 5 experimental conditions and 1 control for a total of 6 experimental conditions. Now, maintaining the same level of effect and power, I would need just over 1,000 subjects. Still, I can't estimate the interactions between the components. So say now I chose to consider a complete factorial, where I have my 5 components, 2 levels of each. That yields 32 experimental conditions, but I only need 352 subjects to be adequately powered to detect an effect of 0.3. How is this possible? Well, the way that the effects get estimated is more efficient use of the subjects, and so you can have fewer. Now, 352 subjects divided evenly across our 32 experimental conditions ends up with, I think, 11 per condition. So a small n per condition, fully powered to detect main effects, as well as all of the interactions between the components. I think this is super cool, if you couldn't tell. Powering the factorial optimization trial is one of the things I get asked about most. To determine your appropriate effect size that you want to be able to detect, you would pick the smallest among your components. So if your components range from 0.15 to 0.3, you're going to pick the 0.1, the smallest, the 0.15, so that things are adequately powered. If your resources are tight, or if this is kind of your first foray into optimization, you might consider increasing your alpha. So we often recommend folks move from the traditional 0.05 alpha to a 0.1 during the optimization trial. And we'll just also pause here to say that a factorial experiment can handle multi-level data. So if you do research in clusters like clinics or schools or group-based therapy, you can still do a factorial experiment. It can get a little complicated in terms of like the reality of finding the number of clusters you need, but many people have done it. There's always ways to figure it out. So in a factorial experiment, we are trying to estimate the main effects of each one of the factors, as well as the interactions between the factors. So just very quickly, I want to show you that for factor A, the main effect is calculated as the mean of conditions 1 through 8 compared to the conditions 9 through 16. Factor B, it's the mean of conditions 5 through 8 and 13 and 6 through 16 compared to 1 to 4 and 9 to 12. And this goes on for C and D. So those are the main effects. When we talk about interactions, there's two that we're particularly interested in. One is the synergistic interaction. That's when the combined effect of two or more factors is more favorable than would be expected based solely on the main effects. In contrast, the antagonistic interaction is when the combined effect of two or more factors is less than you would expect based on the main effects alone. This is something that we don't estimate in the RCT. We can't. And so that we're able to kind of graph these things makes the factorial experiment really exciting in terms of optimizing the intervention. So historically and traditionally, the data from a factorial optimization trial are analyzed using a factorial ANOVA, the regression model. And some people get curious where the x's come from in this equation. Well, we use effect coding to analyze these data as you do in a factorial ANOVA. And the x's come from each one of the factors here, so the interactions and the main effects, and then each one of the experimental conditions has its own regression equation, and the beta estimates come from that cell. Okay, so that's like the how-to, and I've started to get into the analyzing of data. Now we're going to walk through really quickly an example of decision-making. So we've done the optimization trial, we have our data, we've analyzed it, we are applying our optimization criterion and trying to identify that optimized intervention. This is all within the purview of the optimization phase. So this example is a 4-component smoking cessation intervention, and it's comprised of a pre-quit nicotine patch, a pre-quit counseling patch, in-person counseling, and telephone counseling. And so here you see all 16 experimental conditions and the different levels of each one of those factors. So based on the optimization trial, say this is our regression equation, and we plug it in and get our results. So here now we see our predicted days smoke-free. That was our goal for the intervention, our outcome of interest. And we see that the greatest number of predicted days smoke-free is obtained in experimental condition 16, where all 4 components are on. Now, let's suppose we have a constraint on money, and the insurers are only willing to pay $500 per participant, so the optimization criterion was the best expected outcome on days smoke-free obtainable for no more than $500 per person. And so we were able to determine the implementation cost of each combination of the components. So we plug those in, whether it's on or off, and get an expected cost column. So we know that we can only spend $500. Anything over $500 immediately gets the axe, including our 26 days predicted days smoke-free for experimental condition 16, right here. That's $700, so we can't do it. So first, we would look to the cost for $500. That's how much we know we can get. We get 18 days predicted smoke-free with that combination. All right, but if you look, for only $475, we could actually get 20 days smoke-free. So this shows us that the one that fits under our cost might not be the most effective, right? So like $500 doesn't give us the same number of days as $475. Of course, we would choose $475. This, I think, is really cool and could do so much for intervention science, obviously. So this is kind of the decision-making process. We would end up saying that this condition 14, where they get pre-quit patch, pre-quit counseling, and the telephone counseling as our optimized intervention. And we might say at the end of this optimization phase that we expect this to be sufficiently effective. And we can move on to the evaluation phase. However, in the event we decide at this point here that our optimized intervention is not expected to be sufficiently effective, according to the resource management principle, we would not go to the RCT. Instead, we would return back to the preparation phase. So if we do choose to go into the evaluation phase, that's where the RCT comes in, but as I'll show you in just a moment, that's not the only option. You can do other experimental designs here as well. The goal is to confirm the effectiveness of your optimized intervention. One thing I do want to point out up here on this figure is the continual optimization principle. This holds that even an optimized intervention could be further optimized. So there's always more empirical studies coming out to maybe rethink or reconceptualize your components, but also there are always new constraints. And so therefore, there's a continual optimization process. There, that's what I said. Okay, so now I'm gonna give you a very quick walkthrough of an online health, e-health intervention for first-year college students. And this is an intervention designed to target risky sex and alcohol among first-year college students. The intervention is called itMatters, and it's funded by NIAAA, and I've been a co-investigator on it for the past number of years. I'm going to walk you through our process, all of the phases. In the preparation phase, we identified our conceptual model, and I told you they could get more complicated, so here you go, here's the example of it. In this intervention, we identified 5 candidate components, but also this is what we call a constant component. So we felt everybody needed a baseline, a basic information session. You know, ethically, we know that that's kind of the standard, and so everybody got it, and then those 5 components were subjected to experimentation, not the constant component. So each one of these components is affecting one mediator, and then this side of the conceptual model shows how theoretically we're designing each one of these components to get to our ultimate outcome. So just for example, try to pick a simple one. So self-efficacy to use protective behavioral strategies was designed to increase the use of protective behavioral strategies, which would decrease alcohol use, decreasing myopic effects, and therefore decreasing alcohol-related sexual risk behaviors, ultimately leading to the reduction in sexually transmitted infections. And the increased use of protective behavioral strategies would directly decrease the alcohol-related sexual risk behaviors. So this feels a little bit like a path diagram, but it's not, it's a conceptual model. Anyway, this is the engine. This is how the components are designed to affect the outcome. After the preparation phase, we had the opportunity to take an iterative approach to optimization. And this paper is freshly published. So if you're interested, I'm happy to send it to you. This iterative approach looks a little bit different than the way I described to you a moment ago. Here, we still have our 5 components identified from theory and from existing interventions. We subject them first to one optimization trial. Based on the results of that, we revised the components, had a second optimization trial, and then made some decisions from both of those trials as to what would be the optimized intervention, and then that is subjected to the RCT. So optimization trial 1, we had a 2 to the 5 factorial experimental design, 32 experimental conditions. Notice this component is constant, everybody gets it, but then this shows you the combination of all of the different components. We recruited students from 4 universities from across the US, and students just had to be over 18 and either a freshman or a first-year student to be eligible to participate. So our optimization trial 1 results, we had over 2,000 students do the baseline. However, then due to missing data, we had to use multiple imputation to analyze our final data set. We specified that for a component to be included, it needed to have a p less than 0.05. And only the injunctive norms component met this criterion in the first optimization trial. So we undertook some revisions. These were planned, right? We conducted focus groups with students and administrators at each one of the colleges and universities. The goal was to understand what they didn't like and figure out why there was such a problem with participation, and anything that was not meeting the criterion of significance was planned for revision. However, real world science here, in the focus groups, the greatest piece of feedback we received was that the students hated the voice of the narrator, and therefore they stopped doing the intervention. So though we only planned to revise those that didn't meet our criterion, we ended up revising the entire program intervention because they hated the voice of the narrator so much. All right, so we did those revisions, conducted a second optimization trial, same design, same eligibility criteria. We had closer to 3,000 students participate this time, but again had to use multiple imputation for analyses. The same a priori specified criteria of significance was p less than 0.05, and this time both injunctive and descriptive norms met our criterion. So we thought we needed these 5 components to affect our ultimate outcome, but data shows we only need 2. That's a way to make it more efficient. We have our decided optimized intervention. We think it's going to be sufficiently effective, and so we would move to this evaluation phase. Also, the grant required it. They necessitated us to do an RCT within this grant. Ideally, we probably would have gone back and done another round of optimization, but this is where we were. So as I mentioned to you and alluded to earlier, this is where the 2-arm RCT comes into play. But here we took a little bit different of an approach. So we did want to evaluate the optimized itMatters intervention compared to an active control. That's the comparison of itMatters. But we also had this need and opportunity to develop a sexual violence prevention module. The rationale here was the schools that we worked with said if we want to take this intervention and implement it on a wide scale, it has to also have this piece for us to consider it. And so we said, well, let's test it and build that into our next round of optimization. So in addition to evaluating itMatters, we have this second aim where we are assessing the performance of this additional component, kind of an optimization phase within the evaluation phase. I can't see your faces, but I'm assuming you're like, whoa, super cool. To do this, we did a 2x2 factorial experiment. So we have itMatters plus the sexual violence module compared to the active control and the sexual violence prevention module. We also have itMatters compared to the active control only, and then itMatters plus the SVP compared to itMatters alone, and the active control plus the sexual violence module compared to the active control only. We're able to estimate all of these things. Here's what we found out. itMatters remained effective. If you look at the itMatters main effect on our descriptive norms and injunctive norms, but there was no detectable effect, no significant effect on behavior. So these were the intersection of alcohol and sex. So we still affected our mediators, but didn't see anything on our ultimate outcomes of interest. We also were able to look at the effect of the sexual violence component. And so what you want to look at here is the second line, the SVP main effect. And there are a couple that do show significance on these mediators, but now look at this bottom line, the itMatters plus SVP interaction. Nothing is significant here. So what this shows is that we can't just assume adding something to an existing intervention is going to work. We have some initial implication that this could be effective, but we can't just roll it out. We need to refine it and make it work together with itMatters. So that's itMatters in a nutshell. I want to pause here to just acknowledge the relationship between most and translational science. We have a paper in AJPH kind of putting this in conversation. And my opinion is that when an intervention is designed with these implementation constraints in mind, the intervention becomes immediately scalable. If it's not immediate, it is so much closer and so much faster than the traditional, 17 years to get it over the, home plate. So we believe that most has the potential to really, accelerate the progress of the bench to bedside translation and help improve the public health impact of those multi-component interventions. So I said I wanted to whet your appetite, get you thinking about how to use most in your field. The way that I think moving forward, you can learn more and stay connected to figure out how to actually do this, follow me on Twitter, as well as the Optimization of Behavioral and Biobehavioral Intervention Special Interest Group from the Society of Behavioral Medicine. I try really hard to post different resources and applications of most pretty regularly, so you can kind of see different takes on it. And then the best place to start are these two books put out by Linda in 2018. This first book, her authored book, follows the same structure as our 5-day training. So it's really the best place to start if you want to learn more in depth about most. And then this second book, the edited book, is advanced topics. So you can learn more about mediation, adaptive interventions, etc. in that volume. I want to thank you for your time and interest. And I really do mean it. I welcome talking about most with everybody and anybody, no matter the content area. And I hope to see how you choose to employ it. Thanks very much.